I'm now delighted to move into the second part of the webinar, which is a question and answer period with Talia Leszcz, who's a resident expert. Talia, we're so delighted to have you. Talia is a pediatric speech-language pathologist working in the Ontario Preschool Speech and Language Program, and also runs her private practice, Acorn SLP in Toronto. Talia is also an instructor at George Brown College and a lecturer at the University of Toronto. So Talia, thank you so much for joining us. I will stop sharing these slides. Are they still visible on your end?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Are they still visible? Okay, sorry about that. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you, Talia, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So before we get started I have a bunch of questions to ask you, and I'm excited to hear what you think. But before, did you have any sort of broad thoughts or feedback that you wanted to start with?
I think that was great research, and I think you did a great job kind of summarizing the, like, what's the purpose of all that information that you gathered, and I'm excited to talk about it. So yeah.
Great. Okay, so as a first sort of broad question, and you can interpret it as broadly or as narrowly as makes sense to you, what do you think in general about technologies or the role that AI can play in supporting speech-language pathologists' work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think technology is something that, I don't know, for the other speech and language experts in the webinar now, technology wasn't something that I used a lot in my practice, and then slowly, it's really becoming such a part of the way that we have to practice. There's no way that a technology like Babbly, as good as the AI is, could ever replace a speech pathologist. But I do think that there's a lot that both the SLP and the family can get out of technologies like Babbly. So I think on one hand, this gives parents so much information, and the AI technology helps parents, I think, have a better understanding of their child's speech and language development, feel more empowered about how to support their child's speech and language development. And then, they've heard about concepts, or they've heard about things, or they have more knowledge when they come to see the expert. And so in that way, I think it helps both the SLP and the parent tremendously.
Yeah, it's a good point of there being a multifaceted benefit, I guess, not necessarily just for the parent. So do you think the biggest benefit is sort of parents feeling more empowered and like they have more knowledge, or do you think there's am I interpreting it correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's definitely a benefit for me as an SLP. If I'm doing an assessment on a family and I'm able to see some of the analysis that Babbly already did, that is a great tool for me to have an understanding. And I think you kind of touch on this, that parents aren't always the best reporters of babbling. I work predominantly in what's called in Ontario the Preschool Speech and Language Program. It's not the most apt name because we serve a population of birth till school entry, but the majority of our kids are toddlers. The majority of our clients are toddlers, and a parent comes in with a 24-month-old, they don't necessarily remember how they babbled. So if we had that technology, we had that data, I think that could be really helpful in my assessments, or in our assessments as an SLP. So I think, yes, there's the benefit to the parent, and then there's also the benefit to the provider.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for, it's great to hear your thoughts on all of this. Because it is. I was wondering if you had more word to add on the parents not always being 100% the best reporters, because it is such a complex topic, and even reading up about it for months, you can still feel very confused about what different kinds of babbling look like.
Yeah, and I think it's just hard to remember. Like, I know, I have a 6-month-old now, and so I get it. You're tired, and there's so much going on, and it's hard to pay attention. It's hard to remember like what they did last week, let alone what they did 18 months before. So yeah.
Great. So we've kind of veered into what was going to be my next question, which is this ability to track things, right? So I feel like a lot of the advice to parents is to track things very proactively and to track milestones. But this might meet some resistance in parents who aren't really ready to have these discussions, because it's very difficult to accept that a child might not be meeting milestones or there's potential for that. So what are your thoughts on this issue? And again, I invite everyone to also, if you have any thoughts, to provide them in the Q&A box. But
Well, I mean, I think that, first of all, not every parent is going to care to use something like Babbly. I think that there's a type of parent that it might be appeal to more. I think that if you learn that your child isn't developing in the way you expected, or you learn that there's something that could be concerning, it's always hard to hear as a parent. But maybe it's just sort of something they hear and then they tuck away. And if there is a concern, if there is actually a reason that they need to talk to their doctor about it or see a speech pathologist, then maybe it'll be the second or third time that they're hearing about this. And so a parent might be more able to understand what the speech pathologist is saying or the doctor is saying, and might be more accepting of that information. So yeah, I think it could be scary to open the app and to see that, whatever the analysis is, your child isn't quite there yet. But that can hopefully, for some parents, be the instigator for them to seek support earlier and not necessarily wait and see. And at the end of the day, I do think parents have a good instinct. And so, even without an app saying something necessarily, or with an app saying something, I think parents have a gut instinct about when they need to do something and when they aren't ready to do it yet.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's really helpful to hear from an expert too, because there is this sense of parental intuition, but then it's really hard to sometimes find a conclusive answer, right, as to whether that intuition is accurate or not, and that might
I also
cause
think
anxiety.
that in a lot of cases, the families who choose to use an app like Babbly are the ones who just kind of want to check. Things are going well, but they just kind of want to make sure, they want that validation. And so I think that there can be a lot of comfort and a sense of control that parents can get from being able to track that milestones and have such good information.
Great. Yeah. So yeah, milestones in general, as we've been sort of delving into this, there's just so many different ways of even interpreting different milestones. So
Totally.
especially with red flags, and you've mentioned the sort of red flag framing isn't necessarily helpful, or you try to avoid it in your own work.
Yeah. I think, I mean, the term red flag, it just is so scary for a parent to hear. And I think that, you touched on this in the presentation, there's so much normal variability in how children develop language. So to start throwing out this term of like a red flag just because they're doing something on their own trajectory, I think can be quite scary for a family to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's easy to imagine because it's also the bands are sometimes so narrow. And then if you look at a different source, they're really broad, and it's hard to know at what point are you supposed to spring into action or just, be aware of a potential issue.
Definitely.
So, how do you think, have you ever come across an example where the differences between the different sources were really affecting parents, or that they were either too worried or not to say not worried enough, but like you would be more concerned that they weren't necessarily about a given skill?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been families that I've assessed where I was quite concerned, or there was quite a bit of support I wanted to be able to offer, and that they weren't necessarily ready or in agreement. I find that the disagreement on when to act on a certain skill or milestone actually comes up more with pediatricians and family doctors than it does with families, because families often, they have like I said, they have a good instinct. It can be confusing when a doctor's saying one thing and the speech pathologist is saying another thing. I don't know if other people have had situations like that in their own practice, but yeah, I definitely think that it can be confusing for families, and so the more knowledge they have around the milestones, the better.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that we've noticed a little bit in just talking to parents is that the CDC checklist is available as an app also.
Mhm.
So there seems to be potentially more reliance among parents on the CDC milestones, and as we've even seen today, just in the poll, that's not really the preferred source of truth for speech language experts. So that's an interesting sort of contrast that I'm sure comes up a bit.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I've actually been on mat leave since the CDC changed their milestones.
Mhm.
So with the new updated milestones, I haven't been working since it happened, but definitely. And I think that speech pathologists in general will rely on sources like ASHA and SAC. And for anyone who doesn't, I think there might be a lot of American speech and language experts here. SAC is the Canadian National speech and language organization, so it's the kind of the ASHA equivalent here. Um, that experts might rely more on those sources than pediatricians or families who don't necessarily have access to that data in the same way.
Yeah, so thank you for providing
Mhm.
the actual definition. I forgot to actually define the source before, but yeah, yeah. So it's interesting in how just the accessibility of the resource can impact on how much it's trusted, I guess, in that sense. So
And I
definitely.
also think it's important to know and just kind of remember that a milestone is just like a snapshot in time. And when a speech pathologist is doing an assessment, we're looking at so much more than just like if we can check that box if they're doing that skill. So it's just, I think that the milestone checklist, whatever milestone checklist you're using, is just sort of a guide to
Hmm.
see if further support would be needed.
That's a really nice way of phrasing it, and I don't think I've come across that sort of framing necessarily, or maybe as much as I feel like would be comfortable. I'm not a parent, but what I imagine would be comfortable if I
Mhm.
were, which is that, you have to take into account the trajectory and the fact that there's improvement from the previous snapshot to the current one, and not necessarily that there's this key thing that needs to be.
Exactly. And all the other skills that the child has to be doing before they can do that skill. They might
Mhm,
be kind of
mhm,
really moving along on the trajectory quite nicely. They just don't have that specific ability yet.
mhm. So you mentioned before that there's actually potentially more disagreements between, or not disagreements, but just differences between SLP sources and pediatrician sources. So I was wondering if you had some examples or thoughts on the differences on the red flag or the milestones that might be the most different between SLPs, pediatricians, and parental intuition potentially.
Yeah, I think well in Canada, it's probably similar in the States. Children go for their well baby checkup. They go for like their annual or semi-annual checkup, and the doctors usually will complete a quick milestone checklist at those appointments. Um, but so many pediatricians tell families to wait and see.
Hmm.
So about like a whole host of different milestones, um, not saying their first word, not combining words, not babbling a lot, not responding to their name, um, maybe lack of certain types of play skills. Um, I, I don't know why, but pediatricians I find time and time and time again just tell families to wait. They tell them to wait, and then they come in for their assessments, and they're 2.5, and they still aren't combining any words. And it's like if someone had just sent them to us 6 or 12 months ago, um, that maybe we could have sort of just given parents a lot of tools to be able to support their child along the
Hmm.
way, and not let it get to the point where parents are quite stressed now and worried about it. I don't know, I would say there isn't a specific milestone. I think it's just across the board, like just general
Hmm.
communication, development of communication skills. And it's funny because I see it a little bit now as a parent um, with some of the motor milestones. I asked my doctor, my child's almost 7 months, he's not rolling yet. So I asked his pediatrician about it, and she was like, "Oh, it's fine. I'm not worried at all." And I was like, "Well, I'm worried. So what do I do about it?" So,
Hmm.
called a physiotherapist who's going to come in and tell me what I should do.
Mhm.
It's always just interesting to sort of be on that side of it. I think some parents might say, "Oh, if doctor's not worried, I'm not worried," but I was like, I feel like I don't trust pediatricians, so I'm worried. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good example of like how you have to sort of advocate once you sort of sense that something is
Hmm.
potentially not perfectly on track or
And you
that you
shouldn't
just
have to
want to get a
advocate.
second opinion. Yeah,
A parent
exactly.
shouldn't have to be responsible for keeping track. That should be the
Mhm.
professional's job. But I think sometimes it's helpful for parents for sure to just have more information, have the most information they
Mhm.
can have.
Yeah, it's very difficult to sort of yeah, know that you're supposed to be this advocate when, you're not necessarily an expert in a given area and
Exactly.
there's so much
Exactly.
information to keep track of. So we do see in the I'm just monitoring the Q&A
Yeah.
while we're on the topic. We had a response saying that practicing outside the US, doctors do the same as far as wait and see, and
Mm,
also boys develop later than girls, which is not something that we mentioned here, but that is a very common sort of thing that we hear about as well, right?
it is a really
With
common.
language.
I'm glad that someone just put because we just actually put a blog post up on Babbly's
Yes, that's right.
blog about that specific idea because so often parents would come in and say, "Oh, like he's not talking yet, but he's a boy, so I'm not that worried." Or my doctor said boys develop later than girls, and it's like there are differences in how they develop, but there's still milestones that should be met. And there's still sort of
Mhm.
an expected trajectory of development. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, I'm glad someone posted that. Definitely check out the blog post and let us know if you have any feedback or anything to add to it.
Yeah, exactly. So is that something that you've come up against as well with, examples where they've, yeah, like the wait and see as well as the boys develop later? So you've had
I
that
think it's all kind of
experience?
tied in. It's like wait and
Hmm.
see because boys develop later than girls, or they're learning more than one language, so they should be their language delayed because they're learning more than one language, and it's like
Hmm.
no, we know that that's not a thing. Um,
Yeah.
so, or it could also not that information could not come from a doctor. That could just come from Google. Um,
Hmm. Yeah.
so yeah, yeah.
Yeah. We do have a question from an attendee asking why you think there's a difference in the pediatrician's approach to wait and see versus the SLP approach. And follow up, how do you advise parents who have been asked to wait and see?
So to the both great questions. To the first question, like I don't know. um, I think that there's a combination of factors. I think that on one hand, those doctor appointments are pretty fast and kids aren't themselves. They're, at least here in Ontario, they're maybe like 10 minutes. Sometimes they're getting a vaccine or a shot or something as well. So child's not going to be kind of their best selves. They're in a foreign environment. Child's not going to necessarily be acting themselves. And so I think pediatricians sort of assume that parents are kind of overreacting and encourage parents to wait and see more.
Mhm.
Um, I know I've heard in Ontario specifically pediatricians say, "Oh well, the public system is so overloaded that we figured it wasn't worth referring yet." And it's like, well,
Mm.
we're never going to get more funding for the public system if we don't actually get the number of referrals that we need to be seeing. So I don't know if it's similar in other areas where people are practicing. I'd be curious to hear about what kind of how tuned in doctors are to the wait times for early intervention. Um, I think doctors are just kind of a bit more laissez-faire about it. Just they don't they're paying attention to other things. Their job is
Mhm.
focused a little bit more on some of the other very important parts of development, like weight gain and growth and things like that.
Mm.
And they're just not as familiar with a lot of the kind of more nuanced speech and language communication milestones that we see.
Mm.
In terms
Um,
of the second question, sorry, Eva, did I? We'll
no,
just move
I
on.
was just going
Yeah,
to refresh the second question, which is how you advise parents who have been asked to wait and see.
I usually I think it's kind of can be a very difficult conversation to have with a parent who's like, no, 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 my doctor said it's fine. But first of all, if they're coming to see you, there's obviously they have some sort of intuition or some sort of concern that they want to get addressed. And if you're finding a parent's kind of like, I don't want to deal with this, or I don't see this as a problem, I like to try to sort of rather, because you can't force that information onto parents. You can't force them to be worried. You can't force them to take action. And even if they're like, okay, you're telling me I should do something about this, but I'm not that worried, they're the parent who's not going to go home and do their home practice that you give them and carry over the strategies that you want them to work on. So I try to sort of seek to understand where parents are coming from. And maybe that first appointment is a conversation not about, here are the results of my assessment and this is what you need to do, but like kind of seeking to understand a little bit more, why aren't they worried? Why do they feel like they should just wait and see? And really trying to understand more where parents are coming from so that you can kind of meet them when people have had this similar kind of encounter. If a parent is resistant to the information that you want to share with them, you can't just give them that information if they say they were told to wait and see, or they're just not worried, they want to wait and see. I try to have a conversation where I can sort of seek to understand where parents are coming from, and just get a better sense of, are they waiting and they trying to wait and see because of like a cultural difference, or because they're scared, they don't know how to access the system, are they in denial? Like, what is the reason that they're pushing a wait and see approach? And I try to sort of build a rapport with the parents so that maybe not that day, but maybe the next time they come to see me, they'll have a little bit more faith or trust in what I'm saying. And I try to give really specific examples and be really, really concrete about what exactly I'm seeing. So yeah, I don't think that there's kind of this is what you do when the parent's in denial or parent wants to wait and see, but I think that building rapport with the parent is usually the best approach to take.
So that's a really interesting thought. I mean, and it sounds like a really healthy approach, and it kind of builds on the approach that you were describing earlier when it comes to sort of building up a more supportive parent-child dynamic. It kind of feels like that's kind of filtered down from having a supportive relationship with the speech language pathologist as well.
100%. No matter what, if a parent doesn't believe what you're saying, they're not ready to accept the information you're saying, they're not going to go home and implement the strategies that you gave them, or carry out the activities that you suggested. So there's no point in sort of spending your time on that. It's better to kind of build that rapport. Have parents leave your sessions feeling confident and empowered and happy about their relationship with their child. I think it's always kind of the most important thing we can do.
Yeah, that sounds like a really important thing to sort of build up and foster in that relationship, and I'm sure it also leads to better outcomes down the line as far as their child's language therapy.
Exactly.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So I guess we've covered a lot of the different barriers in the questions and answers that we've talked about. Barriers to accessing therapy. One is being sort of resistant or concerned or anxious about it. That one common one that's popping up in the chat currently as well is this difference between pediatrician and SLP approaches. Do you have any other thoughts on like what other barriers might be and how you've approached kind of dealing with them in that scenario?
So many barriers. And I can see just from some of the chats that I think there's people joining us from all over. I'm sure everybody has their stories of the barriers that they see. I know for sure in Ontario, working in the public system, it's hard for families. It's hard. And I see it now as a parent, like it's hard to carry out the recommendations. It's hard to find the time. It's hard to just like go to the bathroom. So it's like, I get it. So I think just sometimes parents are under-resourced, overwhelmed. And, it goes back to the idea of just be there for the parent, build the relationship with the parent, and you'll have the biggest impact on them and their children.
Yeah, that seems like an important point that keeps sort of recurring, of like building this, supportive relationship. We do also, so you were asking earlier in one of our discussions that how it compares to other places, and we had a response saying that in BC and Canada that it's the same. So the GP, you need a GP referral to be able to access SLP intervention, which can further.
I think it says you can't even see a pediatrician without a GP referral. So I guess most children just have GPs.
Sorry, I misread that. Sorry.
And the truth is, in Ontario, you know, like my child sees a family doctor, sees a GP, because I'm a bit biased against pediatricians, but I think even pediatricians just have they're generalists. They don't know enough about the specific milestones in each area of development. So yeah, I think it's just common that doctors are experts on certain things, but just not on everything.
Yeah, and it, Miriam followed up asking if GPs might be more open to referring families, and it sounds like it's hit or miss. Does that track with your experience, I guess?
I think, yeah, I'd say yes, it is hit or miss. The public program that I work in, the wait lists are not that long. The program is pretty easy to access. In Canada, it's very different than in the US. You just get referred and you get service. You don't need to have a diagnosis. There's no like insurance code that I need to worry about with a child meeting to be able to serve them. But I think that doctors don't always know about the program. GPs don't always know that there's this great program out there that they can refer to.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's also the part of the barrier is also just, I guess, system level understanding of like what's out there and what pediatricians and GPs could refer infants to. Yeah, so we're almost at time. So unless there's any other questions, I've gone through all the things I wanted to ask about. So it seems like we can kind of wrap up here. So thank you, Talia, so much. These were all super interesting thoughts, and it was so great to hear your thoughts and like let you answer some of our questions. And I'd also like to thank all the attendees for taking the time to join us, and again, invite everyone to join us again in the future. So thank you all. Please connect with us on social media. Look up our website. We have a section for SLPs. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your Wednesday and great rest of your week. So thank you again, Talia.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And thanks for all your hard work, Eva.
Thank you. Thanks. Take care.